Parkdale, Hyde Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's always a privilege to rise in this House, and it's particularly a privilege when it comes to speaking about housing and to speak about the rights of tenants, because, quite frankly, they don't have many. I was listening intently to the member from Oxford, and he made some excellent points about the time allocation motion. Absolutely, we should be hearing from tenants' organizations more. But let me say we only agree on that. We pretty much disagree on everything else. Right now, in my riding, in Parkdale Hyde Park, we have a rent strike. It started May 1st. And on my radio show yesterday, I had one of the incredible young lights, young leaders of that rent strike, a wonderful young woman named Elisa Kazam. And Elisa talked about the impact that rental increases, and by the way, this is on a building that was built pre-1991. But their landlord, their property management firm, has applied for above rental guideline increases. These are an incredible burden on people who are on fixed incomes. If you're a senior and you're on a fixed income, if you're on ODSP or OW and on a fixed income, or if you're a minimum wage earner, which many of the tenants in South Parkdale are, 3% rather than 2%, and 3% over consecutive years makes a substantial difference. It makes a difference between whether you can stay in your apartment or whether you have to find other lodging. And let me tell you, there is no other lodging in the City of Toronto. So when people are forced out of their apartments in South Parkdale, they're going to end up outside the city, even if they have to work in the city. This is an unconscionable move on the part of property managers, and this is happening under the old legislation, under the old regulations. Now we see, this output of condo rentals and other rentals where there are no protections at all, where after a lease is up, and we had, again, just on the outskirts of my riding, an instance of someone getting an increase of double their rent after their lease was up. Double their rent. What is that message saying? Well, I'll tell you what it's saying, and I'll tell you what, in this case, Metcalf, who's the property manager that's inspired the rent strike in their properties in Parkdale, is saying to their tenants, get out. Get out. That's what it's saying. Why are they saying get out? Because we don't have real rent control in the province of Ontario. Because property managers can say get out and double the rent. What we have is called vacancy decontrol. So if they can muscle the tenants out of those units by hook or by crook, guess what? They can charge anything they like for that unit. And above rental guideline increases can be asked for tarting up a foyer, making balconies look prettier. These are not serious maintenance issues necessarily, and even if they were serious maintenance issues, don't tell me that property managers that own buildings in downtown Toronto haven't made considerable profits over the time they own their buildings. And I know, I listened to the member from Oxford. Yes, I too have been lobbied by landlords who will come to me and say, I can't keep going, I can't make repairs, I can't fix up my units with the current rental guidelines and the proposed ones, which, by the way, of course, was the member from Toronto Danforth's bill just put into reality by the government to extend that 1991 deadline, which makes no sense. So I say to these landlords when they come to see me, if your business, which I would say to any small business or large business person, if your business is not profitable, why are you staying in it? Why don't you sell your property and move into another line, a line of business? If you sell your property in downtown Toronto, you'll see phenomenal increases over what you paid to purchase that property. Why don't you sell it? Then the room goes quiet, Mr. Speaker, except for one landlord who said to me, well, then I'd have to pay property capital gains. Capital gains about 30% at worst. So you'll only make $1 million or $2 million instead of $3 million on your property. Give me a break. Really? I don't know of any other small business that has seen the kind of capital gains, which, let's face it, are real gains, on their investment than property managers and property owners have in the City of Toronto that rent out to tenants. So, forgive me, my sympathy does not lie with them. My sympathy lies with the tenants who have no place to go. And let us remind ourselves that we are living in a country and in a province that signed on to the UN Declaration that said everyone deserves housing, that you cannot move forward in your life without stable housing. We're not living that out. We're not living it out in Ontario. We're not living it out anywhere, Mr. Speaker. And what does that mean if you don't have stable housing? Well, it means that we have 180,000 waiting for affordable housing, with wait lists in Toronto and the GTA and across Ontario that last 10 to 12 years. And guess what? TCHC housing, affordable housing units, are being allowed to fall into disrepair because nothing in the government's budget was allocated to do those necessary repairs that are worth about $2.5 billion. $2.5 billion is way too much to be shouldered by any municipality. Toronto needs, and Mayor John Tory has said they need this government, the provincial government, to step up and help pay for the repair of those units. Up to a third of Toronto community housing units are going to fall into disrepair when we need housing most. You know, governments, provincial and federal, have just got out of the housing business. You know, one of our proposals over the years back was to build 10,000 new units of affordable housing. When was it last heard in these halls that a government committed to new builds of affordable housing? Haven't heard it since I've been here. Haven't heard it. Haven't seen it. Haven't seen it federally or provincially. We have not stepped up to address the crisis by repairing housing units we already own, by new builds. It took almost 9 years to get this government to move on inclusionary zoning, something that governments across North America and around the world have used when tax dollars aren't in plentiful supply to provide affordable housing. So in the wake of doing not much, about providing affordable housing, we finally have them because they've been pushed by the craziness of the market out there, where, as I said, a landlord can double the rent after the lease is up, and has. Finally, they brought in some modest reforms. But are they enough, Mr. Speaker? And I can tell you they're not enough. A couple of weeks back, we passed as a House my motion to add a gender lens to the budget, to look at how the budget affects women, and an intersectional gender lens, so women and also women of colour and trans women. And I can tell you, they voted for it, but they didn't do it. And a key example of that is housing. Key example of that is housing. You know, it's rare that a person in the NDP can agree with a person in the Progressive Conservatives, but Mayor Tory and myself and all of us are on the same page on this one, when he said what he got from the government on affordable housing with this budget was a big goose egg. That's what we got. The member from Oxford mentioned the retroactive to April 20th issue. And not only am I hearing from landlords, but I am hearing from tenants whose landlords saw the moves coming and jacked up their rent in anticipation of those moves coming. So, of course they would, and of course they have. So I'm also hearing from them saying, in what world is that fair? You know, this is advanced knowledge. Basically, it's giving the landlords, you know, advanced knowledge so they can jack up the rents before the legislation is enacted. That's a real problem. You know, ages ago, we have asked, and housing activists asked in Toronto, that 1% of every budget, both federal and provincial, be set aside for affordable housing. This government has never done that, never come close. Federal government hasn't done that, hasn't come close. That's what brings us to this crisis. And I have to say that the last time we really saw governments of all stripes and all levels involved in housing was in the 70s. In the 70s. And I'll give you an example of that. And this is being very partisan of me, because it was a Conservative government federally, it was a Conservative government provincially, and it was David Crombie as mayor, Conservative in the mayoral seat in Toronto, that did it in the 1970s. So there's no reason any political party can't get behind this. And that was St. Lawrence Market, still the gold standard for affordable housing. How did they start? We had Mr. Crombie come into Parkdale High Park and tell us, how did you get it done? He said we started with co-op housing. Again, we have to make it easier for co-op developments to get off the ground. And he said they did it with affordable government-built housing and also market housing, all mixed together into what you have to admit is a wonderful place to live around St. Lawrence Market. You can't tell which is co-op, which is market-driven priced housing, and which is government housing there. It's a neighbourhood. It's a community. That's what communities should look like right across the GTA. A GTA, Mr. Speaker, in which we're adding about 70,000 people a year. 70,000 people a year. The city size of Kingston is being built in downtown Toronto, year after year after year. We have to confront that as well, because I can tell you that issues about the OMB, that issues with people who live around the new developments that are going up are not being dealt with either. That's a whole other problem and a whole other sector. But to get back to tenants and to finish maybe where I started, and that is to talk about the beleaguered tenants across our city and the fact that there are not very many options open to them. We live in one of the most expensive jurisdictions, if not the most expensive in Canada. We have rents now that are soaring and completely out of line with incomes. Completely out of line with incomes. Incomes have been stagnant. Jobs are precarious. Work is precarious. Again, we hope to see a $15 minimum wage in the budget. We didn't see that. So jobs are precarious, incomes precarious, wages are stagnant, and yet the cost of housing has gone through the roof. How to respond? Government has taken very small steps. We would like to see in the New Democratic Party some braver, more courageous steps, because the situation is going to get worse. It's not going to get better. I can tell you that home ownership is like winning the lottery for the next generation in the City of Toronto. It's completely outside their imagination to be able to afford to buy a house for the vast majority of young people. You can't build a city on that. So the only way, for example, my children will be able to afford to buy a house in Toronto, this is a pretty common baby boomer story, is to inherit ours. That's the only way. That is the only way. And again, this country and this province and the city have been built on our children doing better than we do. Not worse, better. And that's clearly not going to happen. So again, listening to the Conservative comments from the member from Oxford, yes, should we have more input to this bill? Absolutely. That's called democracy, and we should hear from more tenant groups. But I can tell you what we will hear if we heard from more tenant groups. We'll hear a long list of complaints of which this Liberal legislation does very little to address. So with that, I'm going to take my seat and leave room for others in our caucus to weigh in. But suffice to say that as we sit and deliberate here, the rent strike continues. 250 tenants against Metcalf, which, by the way, won the Golden Cockroach Award about 10 years ago, and amounting to about $250,000 worth of rent. That kind of initiative, that kind of breaking of the law, because their backs are to the wall and they have no other alternative, is going to spread across our city and across our province if we do not respond, and if we do not respond with some backbone. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.